It's been a great week. It's exactly 40 years since the first International Computer Music Conference was held at Michigan State University in East Lansing under the chairmanship of David Wessel. At that point, in 1976, several strands of thought, creative practice, and technology had come together to inform a research agenda that coined the term computer music, and that term has been with us ever since. Even by 1976, however, I suggest that the term covered a pretty broad range of technical and aesthetic concerns. So, alongside Max Matthews' music programs, Yanis Xenakis was developing his UPIC system in Paris. Peter Zinoviev in London was using a mini-computer to control his Synthi voltage-controlled analog systems. In Utrecht, Gottfried Michael Koenig was developing algorithms and synthesis software in his series of projects, and so on. The point here is not so much to tell the history of a widely distributed effort involving many extraordinary individuals, as to recall for a moment the nature of the enterprise, and in particular the contrast between the excitement and the effort. As John Channing so eloquently described to us on Tuesday, a computer in 1976 was an enormous physical object. It cost many thousands of dollars, required space, an air conditioning system, and dedicated administration. Computers are exciting because they represent On the other hand, their operation was difficult and time-consuming. Even typing commands into a terminal was often a non-real-time activity. The point of this brief moment of historical reflection is not to wonder at the advances that have taken place subsequently, but to take stock of the methodology at work here. To work with computers brought prestige and demanded funds and facilities. The work paradigm asserted the difficulties of the business of investigating and creating sound, and the encapsulation of the work of music as a large-scale problem, incapable of solution except with the unparalleled computational power of a dedicated machine. Today things are very different, and I will briefly run through the comparisons that we all know, just in order to focus the nature of the issue I want to consider this morning. So, earlier today, I was woken up by a small and immensely powerful computer sitting next to my bed, which I then popped into my jacket pocket as I left my room. It needs no air conditioning, nor does it require any very specialist attention. As I leave, it alerts me to a message sent by my partner. Then, being uncertain about the location of the analysis center, I get lost very easily. I use my fingers to negotiate the appearance of a scalable map of Athens, on which I find my route, and a small blue marker on the map follows my progress in real time. To calm my nerves, I pop in my earphones and select a suitable piece of music to play as I walk, all on the same tiny device. This is an utterly different enterprise to that of the historical computer. Each of these actions represents an enormous and complex set of computations, but those computational efforts are not the focus of the apparatus. They are utterly transparent. I need to know nothing except for Lucan point. So I think this tiny computer is not an extraordinary version of the monster from 1976. It does not compute the results of my problems so much as it connects and contextualizes me in a network of data. This is not something remote from ordinary people. Everyone has such a device. The possession of a particular make or model may indeed provide some prestige, but it's a prestige that is local and informal. The devices are fun. Those of us who saw personal computers at the start and who became addicted to keeping up to date and who took pride in maintaining the fastest model we could afford are suddenly looking anxiously at a marketplace where new models are slow to appear. In the face of ubiquitous mobile technologies, will the computer as such even survive? The paradigm has shifted, and the network enfolds us. Far from presenting as slaves to our incommensurable desires, computers are now our points of connection within a network of social relationships and contingent information. What are the implications of this fact for music? The subtitle of this conference, From Digital Ethos to Virtual Ethos, reminds us that sound has implications for human beings, and it is sound itself that I want to consider. The word ethos implies sound in an unformed state. So Little and Scott's Greek lexicon gives the definition of ethos as of the confused noise of a crowd, the roar of the sea, the groaning of trees in the wind, etc. This is the meaning that Michel Serres uses in his book Genesis when he writes about the fundamental medium within which human beings operate. And he takes the sea as a source and metaphor. And this is the principal clue to the thread of my talk this morning. So, Serres writes, the silence of the sea is an illusion. The sounds of the depth never ceases, is limitless, continuous, perpetual, unalterable. It has no depth itself, it has no contradictions. Sound cannot be a phenomenon. All phenomena detach themselves from it, like figure on the ground, like a fire on a heath. Like all messages, all cries, every call, every signal has to detach itself from the din that occupies silence in order to be perceived, to be known, to be exchanged. So here we begin to understand sound and listening as dependent variables, mutually defining, equal in operation. When, in a lecture given at Yale University in 1962, entitled The Electronic Medium, Edgar Varèse coined the phrase organized sound, he also encapsulated a defining approach to the nature of sound itself. For Varèse, sound appears as a raw material from a mysterious world, in an industrial environment, where he describes himself as a worker in rhythms, frequencies, and intensities. The computer is the machine which, like the blast furnace and the mechanical hammer, ensures that, and I quote, composers are now able, as never before, to satisfy the dictates of that inner ear of the imagination. Design and make. This echoes an earlier manifesto from June 1917, in which Varèse proclaimed, I dream of instruments ingredients to my thought, and which, with their contribution of a whole new world of unsuspected sounds, will lend themselves to the exigencies of my inner rhythm. Here, the notion that the computer is capable of producing any sound you can imagine, or undreamed of timbres, in any combination I choose to impose, creates and continues a rhetoric of control and domination that I want to question for a moment. If, in its beginnings, the computer presents as a machine for the industrial manufacture of sound, what alteration to this paradigm is proposed by the existence of the network? In an interview in 2009, Max Matthews, presciently as always, proposes that the future of computer music, quote, is going to revolve around experimental psychological studies of how the brain and ear react to sound. And this raises the question of listening, which is what I want to address next. How can we extend our understanding of the relation of sound to listening? Listening has been the subject of a considerable amount of discussion in recent years. Sociologists, neuroscientists, psychologists, and cultural theorists have all reached the conclusion that listening as a central phenomenon in human experience is not as well understood as common sense would suppose. The common sense paradigm of listening is laid out clearly by Theodor Adorno in his essay Current of Music, where he writes, "The question of why we follow this descriptive or phenomenological method can easily be answered. We are dwelling on the phenomenon of music-oriented loudspeaker because it is actually the phenomenon which determines the reaction of the listeners, and it is our ultimate aim to study the listeners." This places sound and listening in a teleological relationship that is at the heart of philosophical and scientific investigations of musical meaning and communication. This relationship is also, as Jonathan Stern points out, consolidated by the seeming directionality of the wires and speaker mouths of sound reproduction technologies that, as Adorno agrees, appear to be aimed at the ears of the listener. Stern writes, "The salient features of audial technique considered here, the connection of listening and rationality, the separation of the sense, the segmentation of acoustic space, the construction of sound as a carrier of meaning in itself, and the emphasis on physical, social, and epistemological mediation are all fundamental to the ways in which people listen to and with sound reproduction technologies." So here we have a paradigm in which sound and listening are independent and self-sufficient, where sound, as a phenomenon in its own right, is susceptible to the sort of design and control proposed by Varese, Scheffer, and others, and where listening, as a decoding of meaning and affect for human purposes, can be studied psychologically, sociologically, and neurologically for our better understanding. Is there another paradigm for listening? Consider this account by Penny McCall Howard of the experience of working on a fishing boat in the North Sea. A trawler at sea is also an incredibly noisy place, and every sound is significant. Yet these sounds were interpreted not so much by listening as by a constant adjustment of tools, machines, and enormous weights and tensions. New crew needed an education of attention in order to feel the ground and react appropriately in order to keep the trawl going. They had to learn to distinguish the vibrations coming through the fishing gear from the constant noise and vibration of the engine, the whine of the electronics, and the shuddering and slamming of the boat itself in the waves. Fishermen use these techniques to work productively, and also to develop complex descriptions and visualizations of what their fishing gear and the seafloor far below looked like. So the critical phrase here, I think, is education and attention, a concept that comes from James Gibson's ecological approach to visual perception. This ecological paradigm proposes sound and listening as much more curiously intertwined. Sounds are not just there for the taking. They have to be identified, perhaps even constructed, in an interplay between the phenomenon of the sound and the phenomenon of the listening. This formulation goes to the heart of what I'm attempting in this talk, part of the consideration of ethos, which is an evening out of the hierarchies of the world in a way that places humans as no more equal than other phenomena. Now, lest this sounds too hippie, here is the psychologist Eric Clarke's account of the ecological approach to listening. Rather than considering perception to be a constructive process in which the perceiver builds structure into an internal model of the world, the ecological approach emphasizes the structure of the environment itself and regards perception as the pickup of that already structured perceptual information. The simple but far-reaching assertion is that the world is not a beaming, buzzing confusion, but is a highly structured environment, subject both to the forces of nature, gravity, illumination, organic growth, action of wind and water, and so on, and the profound impact of human beings and their cultures. And that in a reciprocal fashion, perceivers are highly structured organisms that are adapted to that environment. End quote. Like the fishermen and the trawler who have to adapt to a sound world through an education of attention and physical action, Clarke proposes that we also have to attend to and adapt to our sonic environment, and that this is not only a matter of contingent necessity, but is also an evolutionary process that has been happening since the start of human culture. Indeed, from a cultural perspective, our education of attention as musicians is already a highly considered activity. As my colleague Simon Fripp has pointed out, so-called art music is curious as an area of life where people are actually taught how to listen in a highly institutionalized fashion. This listening actually constitutes sound, in the sense that our activity of listening in the world negotiates a territory. What is the territory of computer music? Now, the notion of territory has been examined with some care by, for example, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, and clearly in the spirit of music. The child who cries, or the bird that sings, establishes a social configuration of a space that has its own materiality. In the words of Henri Lefebvre, when we evoke space, we must immediately indicate what occupies that space and how it does so. The deployment of energy in relation to points and within a time frame. So this speaks to the particular relationship between music or sound and ourselves. It is clear that this relationship is indeed special and fundamental. As Plato remarks, the world is not bathed in sound as it is bathed in light. There is no sonic equivalent of darkness. And the fact that we hear without the aid of a source of sonic illumination gives sound an inherent and energetic quality, unbeholden to any extraterrestrial power source. Every sound is evidence of a particular vitality, and the provenance and impact of these vitalities create spaces that live and resonate in our personal and shared experiences. In that sense, a soundscape, so-called, consists equally of sound and listening. Its territory is established by the interaction of these two phenomena. One could even argue, as I have done elsewhere, that not only human beings are listening. In that sense, sound needs to be created, and in a very different way to what is imagined by Edgar Varese, not just as something out there, but equally as a construct of the listener. Technology has a part to play in this, and the fundamental notion of the musical instrument as the location of a practice of listening proposes technological apparatus right at the heart of the human enterprise. What territories of sound and listening have established themselves in the age of electronic music? So, in his recent book, Earth Sound, Earth Signal, Douglas Kahn describes the history of electrical communication from the middle of the 19th century in terms of the sounding potential revealed by new technologies. So this, for example, is a description by Herbert N. Casson in 1910 of listening to a telephone line. Noises! Exclamation mark. Such a jangle of meaningless noises had never been heard by human ears. There were spluttering, bubbling, jerking and rasping, whistling and screaming. There were clicks from telegraph wires, scraps of talk from other telephones, and curious squeals that were unlike any other known sound. The lines running east and west were noisier than the lines running north and south. The night was noisier than the day, and at the ghostly hour of midnight, for what strange reason no one knows, the Babel was at its height. This new and fascinating engagement with sound arose not only through the invention of devices that could render electrical signals audible, but also through the interaction of those devices with the energies of the earth itself, creating a new frontier for sonic imagination. The spread of commercial radio only extended this further. So in 1961, first Yuri Gagarin from the USSR, and then Alan Shepard and later John Glenn from the USA, burst into outer space in manned rocket capsules. The American launches were broadcast live on radio. And I remember sitting by my primitive transistor radio built by my uncle with my headphones on, listening to the countdown, pretending I was really taking part. The crackling voices, the static, the relay of the voices of the astronauts, these really were sounds from space. By the following year, the first communication satellite, Telstar, had been launched into orbit, spawning the first hit single by a British band, the Tornadoes, to reach #1 on the US Billboard charts. The pulsing signal from the satellite formed part of the intro, the sound we had already all heard on the news. And the strange warbling of the electronic clavier line, a version of the keyboard instrument developed by Constant Martin in the 1940s, made the melody seem also as if from outer space. By 1963, my family had acquired a television set, and this is a particular moment of reflection for British members of this party. One November evening, we sat down to watch the first episode of the new BBC serial Doctor Who. I still remember it very clearly, the school science lab, and the strange girl who seems to know more about science than the teachers. How after school, two of the teachers followed her back to her home, which seemed to be a blue police box sitting in a scrapyard. But the crucial things were the sounds, the extraordinary swirling and vaporous rhythms of the signature tube, and the terrifying, raucous pumping of the spaceship TARDIS as it dematerialized. These were sounds not just of the imagination, but related to my real experience of the ether. I had heard the sounds of the universe on the radio, and they bound my imagination closer to the science fiction of Doctor Who as they did to the weird music I'd heard on the radio by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Jan Stennis. This little bit of personal history may be interesting because it connects certain elements of technology, sound, and music in a way that reveals what I take to be one of the crucial forces in the art of the last 100 years or so. Of the three technologies that have changed music beyond recognition: telecommunication, recording, and digital computing. I would say it is auditory telecommunication that has most shaped our senses and our imaginations. Even radio static is not dead, it scintillates with detail, and every tiny move of the tuning dial reveals new sounds, human and cosmic. Allegedly, NASA was nervous about making public the first photographs of the whole Earth taken from these space launches because they thought the image would cause some sort of mass anxiety attack. And yet anyone with a radio had already heard the panorama of space, and its influence on music was immense. In the concert hall, audiences were shy of this new sound world, but in the incidental music to films and television, in the feedback, buzz and distortion of the electric guitar and popular music, and at the heart of the avant-garde music of the 50s and 60s, we heard the unmistakable territory of the universe of sound opened up by electrical communication systems. This radio universe is not just a macroscopic but also a microscopic universe. It's not just the static of the ionosphere, it's also the constructs of the transistors and capacitors that make up the radio set. The electronic components are embedded in a system that includes the world and the heavens. And when we listen in, we are able to participate with all of those elements in play. In this context, I would challenge the notion of sonic imagination as some sort of industrial design process prefigured by a free-ranging human creativity. I find it improbable that anyone can imagine a hitherto unheard sound. I give you a moment to hear something you've never heard before. What 19th century technology gave us is a set of technical devices and processes that fundamentally reorganized our listening. How does sound and listening get constructed in the world of the digital network? One of the things about which Bruno Latour has warned us is the danger inherent in the purification of our topics of investigation. Things are always hybrid, and the digital network is no exception. If the nature of the fundamental sonic background is captured by Michel Serres in the presence and metaphor of the sea, the nature of the digital background can be conceived of as a jumbled amalgam of mobile devices, applications, data files shared and purchased, speeds of connection, distributed storage, nodes of interaction, both human and quasi-human, social aggregations of these nodes, and so on. The currents of the sea and the currents of data make a neat comparison, but there are more than subtle differences. In particular, data is now subject to a sort of infinite storage and fragmentation, as files are backed up and deleted successfully across the network. So-called cloud storage and cloud computing mean that data and applications are no longer even integrated by the notions of presence or operation within a particular machine or system. They become radically dispersed, and when their appearances are called up, their constituent parts remain like ghostly presences somewhere in the network. This reminds me of Charles Darwin's thoughts on the material nature of human culture. In his 1881 publication, The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms, with observation on their habits, Darwin makes the singular claim that worms have played a defining role in human history by effecting the process through which human artifacts are preserved. He writes, "Worms protect for an indefinitely long period every object not liable to decay, which is dropped on the surface of the land by burying it beneath their castings." This means that much of human culture depends for its very existence on tiny creatures which render an earth hospitable to humans and which supports and preserves their buildings, rituals, and artifacts. The mulch of the earth hides and casts up the background noise of life. Might there similarly be a mulch of data, turned over by the applications, storage devices, human agents, and social dynamics that constitute a digital network? This formulation purposefully characterizes the network as a hybrid amalgam of devices, protocols, data, power, flesh, and human beings, and by extension animals in the physical world, in a configuration that is non-hierarchical with respect to its flows of energy. As Richard Coyne reminds us, creativity has long wrestled with the machine, which in some respects has come to represent so much of what art is against: automation, control, reproduction, mindless copying, predictability, and of course, capitalist production. But there are also machines that are out of control: runaway devices, malfunctions, breakdowns, glitches. This reminds us not just of malfunctioning machines and networks, but also of the power of malfunction itself. The digital network is not a free-flowing utopia of functionality, however hybrid. It's also subject to hacking and cracking, misuse and dismemberment. Its data flows can circulate, but they can also be tapped and siphoned off, disrupted and held to ransom. As the digital network proposes a sort of globalized control, it proposes forces of resistance and subversion. We remind ourselves that while some artists have produced machines, computer software, and interfaces at the cutting edge of technological development, there are others who have, for example, simply tossed a pile of cheap circuit components into a bowl of water and prodded them randomly with an electrical current to hear what happens. The modernist narrative at the start of computing and computer music proposed an incremental progression of cost and efficiency dictated by Moore's law, where cheaper, faster, and smarter devices would lead inexorably to the sort of knowledge and understanding of sound dreamed of by Baez, that would produce an overflowing abundance of new music of hitherto unimagined beauties through industrial processes of organization. But music is not quite like that. In the dialogue Cratylus, Plato shows Socrates searching for meaning by considering the origins and family histories of words. At one point, Socrates, in speaking of Apollo, says, "The name of the muses and the music would seem to be derived from searching, and they are making philosophical inquiries." Here, music is understood not as some sort of object or artifact, however intangible and transitory, nor is it the focus of a sort of craft or manufacturing. There is certainly a process at work, but that process is one of questioning and the forming of relationships. To search is to define and establish contact with an area, having a purpose in mind, but also open to the activity of reading. What has this area got to tell? As Tim Ingold reminds us, ever since Bacon and Galileo, nature has been thought of as a book that will not willingly give up its secrets to human readers. But for medieval readers, as for indigenous hunters, creatures would speak and offer counsel. This once again reminds us of a sense of agency that is evenly distributed without favouring human participants. While I understand and sympathise with Baez's need to find a new way of expressing what sound could be capable of, organised organisation proposes a sort of activity to which music has often remained resistant. Music searches in sound. It listens in the sense of seeking to find and construct processes, images, and affects. Music is open to what sound has to say. Music is the consequence of listening. I want to express this thought in this fashion, once again, to suggest gently that not only human beings are capable of agency. In a paper presented at the UNESCO Conference on Music and Technology held in Stockholm in 1970, Pierre Schaeffer, the founding father of musique concrète, also addressed the nature of this relationship between sound and music in terms of the body's relationship to the tool. In his case, the computer, for our purposes, extended to include the notion of the digital network. Schaeffer characterizes the nature of the collaboration between the musician and the other thing that makes the sound. He says, "It is true that the more a man communicates with the sound, the more a man communicates with himself." This presents the moment of music as a moment of self-realization in sound, a moment which asserts the internal distance, which allows a being knowledge of itself as an actor in the world. It proposes music first as a private rather than a public act, but it also gives a powerful image of the human as constituted by relationships within a network and as determined by a response to the sounding world. For Schaeffer, the network clearly involves the configuration of human beings and physical tools. In his case, one could say the tape recorder and its technologies of tape. And in recent years, a number of younger artists have rediscovered the original moments of sound technology in a moment of creative archaeology. I think, for example, of the renewed popular interest in radio and analog synth ensembles, or the work of, for example, Alex Kolkowski and others with wax and tin cylinder recording. An interest that has extended even into the popular domain in recent releases by artists like Neil Young and Jack White. Is this a symbolic refusal of the digital? There seems to me to be little evidence of any Luddite or reactionary tendencies here, but there is nonetheless an interesting extension of the hybrid nature of the network, which now abuts the digital and the analog. The physical hand skills of actual materials and the organizational and algorithmic skills of digital materials in ways that test the boundaries of sound's existence for us. This seeming backward step from the grand vision of ever more sophisticated computing presents as a stock-taking of how technologies and humans can interact. And so, finally, to my question to you, what is sound? In this talk, I've tried to think through some of the implications of our current position in a history of music making that is barely 60 years old. This history has unfolded under the sign of technology, as if music has not always been a technological endeavor. But technologies change, and the computational devices that started this particular creative trajectory have transformed into actors in a more complex scenario. In the same way, our very notion of what an actor is has also changed. And this whole argument subscribes to a view propounded by, for example, Jane Bennett and many others, that seeks to flatten some of the hierarchies that have been constructed around humans and technologies, and to notice the hybrid nature of the resulting networks. This flattening has some overtly political and ethical motivations, particularly in relation to the ecological and environmental issues that currently confront us. But I would argue that it also has some very actually useful perches on the necessary discussions around the nature and purposes of art, within a social context that is proving difficult for art, as we have formulated it, to engage with. As sound is the focus of our attentions, I want to conclude by wondering about the implications of such a flattening move for sound and our future engagements with it. In the context of this discussion, sound presents itself not as a perceptual flow or as a set of objects out there and available for human intervention, but rather as a network of disparate components unfolding in time. The network contains, of course, vibrations or signals through a set of connected media, but also locations within those media that are themselves connected by constructions of space that are made by and contain agents or actors. It is the roles and identities, both material and immaterial, taken by those actors that help to define the nature of the network and its purposes that are social, material, aesthetic, or economic. The actors, so-called, can be wires, computer code, mobile devices, human beings, and so on, each with some contingent agency. As with any network, this one can be tapped into at many places, and each point of tapping yields a different perspective on the nature of the network itself, its sonic presence, revealing its motives, its flows of reciprocation, its forces, affects, and its spatial and temporal constructions. What I'm trying to get at here arises out of a composition of machines, objects, physical phenomena, personae, people, social structures and tensions, and everything else that constitutes a site for action. The purpose of this reimagining of sound is to attempt a re-enchantment of our connection with it, to reassert that the relationships we establish with what we love cannot be one way. Relationships pass to and fro in a communicated rhythm that attests to their health and vibrancy. As Sellers asks, what do we give back to the objects of our science from which we take knowledge? Sound is a complement from which, in Tim Ingold's words, we should take counsel in order to ensure that our relation with it and all its wonders continues to thrive. Thank you.